Good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to see so many people joining us again for this month's Learning and Development session, Lived Experience in Research. On our panel today, we have three wonderful researchers joining us, Kylie King, Rosiel Elwin, and Luke Bayliss. I'd like to welcome back all of those people who've joined us on previous sessions, and a warm welcome to all the new folks who are joining us for the first time today. My name is Nicola Parry. I'm the head of Lived Experience Engagement and Integration at Roses in the Ocean, and I'm joined by my team member, Julia Granahan, and we'll be your hosts for today's session. If you'd also like to take this opportunity to introduce yourselves in the chat, we'd love to see who's online with us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands and waters that we live, work, and dream on, and acknowledge that we are joining from different lands today. Julia and I are coming to you from Mianjin, the Yagara and Turrbal people's country, and we pay our respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who join us on this session today. We would also like to acknowledge everyone's lived experience of suicide and thank everyone who joins us today for contributing their invaluable insights, knowledge, and individual expertise to this session and to suicide prevention more broadly. Before we make the introductions that we've all been waiting for, Julia will take us through a few guidelines for this session. Thanks,
Nick. So we will be finalising today's webinar with a Q&A that's open to everyone. And we welcome you to submit your questions throughout the session, but please note that we won't respond to them until we get to the end of the webinar. For some just general housekeeping, if you would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A function on the webinar. This will just help ensure us that we're seeing all of your questions, and we will moderate this throughout the session. We will do our absolute best to cover as many questions as possible throughout today's session, but any that we're not able to respond to in the time we have, we will get back to you offline in the coming days with the responses from our wonderful panelists. So I'll hand it back to you, Nick.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to pass to Rosiel and Kylie and Luke for the presentation and discussion, please. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, my name is Rosiel Elwin. I'm a lived experience researcher, PhD, and I have a Master of Psychology. And I want to start with my reflections as a researcher and a lived experience researcher. Some of these slides I won't go super into depth because I've created a resource slide that will be sent to you after the end of this webinar. So I'll just do a little bit of coverage on some of these. So I won't go super into depth into all of them. And a little bit of a visual description of myself as a speaker, because not everyone, some of you may be listening, and this is just some accommodations for people who may just be hearing and not seeing the visual of these slides. So an orientation to myself as a speaker: I'm a white person, I have dark purple hair, green eyes, and I have a big smile. And the background behind me is sort of pastel colors of clouds, and this current slide is just white, has some text, says lived experience in suicide research, and has a depiction of some plants, and a lot of my slides do have sort of plants and nature-based imagery of them. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start with some common terms that are often used around lived experience research or participatory action research, because often this isn't really, you don't really see a lot of these terms used in research altogether. So it can be difficult for people who may be starting out to understand a lot of these principles, or a lot of these terms might be conflated together. So, and this will be in the resource slide that will be sent out later at the end of this webinar. So a lot of these principles of involving people with lived experience in research involve shared power, reciprocity, participatory action, prioritizing and nurturing relationships, and building capability and skills. And while these principles are what we're aiming for, there can be a lot of challenges and barriers to having this done well. And it can be quite difficult to have this done when people are new to this work. So this is what we're aiming for, but there can be a lot of difficulty to do with structural elements or skills training to have this occur. So different ways that this can be done. There's co-creation, which is active development, which involves people being involved in the work at all stages. So planning, discovery, co-designing, co-evaluating, and delivery in a project. So all stakeholders and people with lived experience are involved in the project at all stages, right from the beginning. And input is continuous throughout the project across multiple channels. So the lived experience engagement is occurring at all stages. Then we have co-design, so that's part of that co-creation. There's the equal and reciprocal relationships between stakeholders in the project. People with lived experience co-lead the development, design, and implementation and evaluation, the activities, the research, and the services. The engagement might be at different stages of the project, but again, it's active, it's quite early. Co-production involves people with lived experience, carers, family, and kin, at every stage of the process, which is using those principles of co-creation and co-design. So collaboration can be different. It involves people with lived experience within a project, but not at those initial creation of the research, design, and development. So involvement is at later stages, could be at recruitment, at data collecting, at implementation, or other stages. And consultation is less in depth. It's often at later stages of the project, so providing insight at recruitment strategies, might be reviewing research plans, reports, or articles, and can involve one or more individuals with lived experience, community groups, or other stakeholders. So common terms often could be evidence-based co-design, experience-based co-design, or participatory action research. Other terms for lived experience researcher might be lived experience academic, consumer academic, or peer researcher, or consumer researcher. So these are terms that, it's helpful to know when you're beginning this work that might be used to refer to someone, or if you're trying to find someone who has this experience, it's helpful to kind of know these terms so you know what you're looking for. A lived experience expert or expert by experience. And then how do you refer to someone who doesn't necessarily use the term lived experience or doesn't identify as someone with lived experience? So that could be an expert by formal education, an expert by formal qualification, an expert by academic education, or an expert by training. So that would be a researcher who doesn't identify as someone with lived experience. So there's also lived experience advisor or lived experience consultant. So that might be someone without research training, but does lived experience consultancy. Then you have lived experience advisory groups, or a consumer advisory group, or an expert advisory group. Next slide, please. So co-design elements involve engaging with the community, working with the community to plan an approach, listening and understanding people's range of experience and exploring opportunities for growth, working together to develop effective tools, and determining and deciding which tools and direction best meet the needs of the community, and then making change for improvement. So there's different kinds of ways to structure and approach co-design. And this figure, these arrows could be going forward and backward, and then going back into the center and then back towards each other. So it's like a forward and backward process throughout the project. Next slide, please. So some of my reflections on lived experience research is that I think of it as a rewarding and fulfilling process, and that it has a lot of alignment with social justice values and advocacy. There's a lot of opportunity to contribute to positive change, so deepening understanding of experiences or a particular phenomena, such as, social experiences, the way people understand something, opportunity to reduce stigma or dismantle current misconceptions about an experience. But there's a lot of considerations for how to engage in this work, such as changing perspectives, there's a life and a permanency for the work itself. So when you're engaging in this research, when putting forward a lived experience perspective or being involved in the work, your perspective about how you experience something may change. And it's important to consider how a project or a research piece was existing at a point in time. It was knowledge and perspective at that point in time, and how you thought about a experience or thought about diagnosis may change, particularly as knowledge updates and current thinking or approaches and treatment updates. And that can lead to different feelings and different engagement in the research. And that's particularly important because you're giving so much of yourself to the work. So that's something that I consider when approaching something like this, because it's an ongoing process. And when you're putting forward so much of yourself into it, you know, it can change. So it can be helpful to think of it as a point in time. If you come back to work and think, you know, I think of this very differently than I did then. There are people who may be affected by disclosures, so it's important to consider that when going into something, that there may be conversations that need to be had, or considerations about how to anonymize certain aspects of your experiences, or just considering how and what ways you inform your own inform the research or inform the project, if it is certain kinds of, you know, autoethnographic research or something like that. Visibility and stigma is important because if you are being visible as a lived experience researcher, there are the nature of it is there's a different level of vulnerability and different levels of boundaries that are needed than when you're coming into a project just as a researcher without the designated lived experience researcher title above the work you're doing. And there's a term that I frequently use, which is vulnerability hangover, which is there can be expected, unexpected, or delayed effects of engaging in project work and being visible as someone with lived experience. And that includes people's reactions to you, their expectations of you, and their thoughts around how vulnerable you may be or not, your capabilities, and you know how they expect your work will be, or their expectations of what your experiences might be, including how, you know, maybe they expect a particular hypothesis and they want you to meet that, or they want you to meet particular research findings and, you know, inform the project in a certain way. So there are a lot of different ways of navigating research work as a lived experience researcher that can be quite complex. And some of those aren't always obvious at the outset. So it's important to sometimes consider how to find support and community when engaging in this work, including connecting with other lived experience researchers, and naming those different layers of this, such as people's expectations as well, and that there are different layers of vulnerability to this that aren't you know, a deficit to lived experience work, but may actually be structural aspects of power within this work, such as people's expectations. Next slide, please. So, some common tension points, challenges, and barriers. I think one of the main challenges or tension points that I would consider is that engagement should be, lived experience engagement should ideally be meaningful, and are assumptions being made about how people with lived experience want to be involved in the research or what capacity and skills they have. So that's a good question to ask at the outset of a research project. So care should be taken to ensure that there aren't assumptions being made about what people can contribute or how they want to contribute. It's important to be open and to discuss how the work can be fulfilling and mutually beneficial. And sometimes it can be difficult to ask those questions or ask, is there a different way that I could contribute to this project? Or, how do you want me to contribute to this project? Or I would really like to contribute in this other way. But it can be important to, when there are expectations, it can be important sometimes to challenge that so that the project feels mutually beneficial. Authentic, quality, lived experience engagement in research can be done at different levels of engagement. So whether it's in co-creation, co-design, consultation, or evaluation, it doesn't always have to be co-creation or co-design. Meaningful engagement can be done at consultation or evaluation. But a good way to look at how to avoid tokenistic engagement is to ask when, why, and how questions. So when is the lived experience engagement happening? Why is it happening at that stage versus at another stage? How will it be enriching and mutually beneficial for everyone involved? Could it be done a different way to improve the experience? So a person with lived experience may be brought onto a research project as the sole voice of a person with identified lived experience on the research team. And this increases the pressure on the person to act as a representative of broadly diverse experiences and intersecting factors and intersecting identity characteristics. So it also increases the pressure on them to be vulnerable and disclosing more. They may find it more difficult to express any concerns about the project or the way the project is run, or to step back or take a break out of fear that they will be typecast as being too impaired to be involved in lived experience work. So it's important to recognize that pressure if they are the sole person with lived experience on the research team. So research teams should try as much as possible to have more than one person with lived experience involved in research. And if budget constraints exist where this isn't possible, there should be open acknowledgement of this as a limitation within the team, and it should be discussed so that the person with lived experience doesn't face undue pressure or expectations. And if you are a person with lived experience being brought onto a research project just as the sole person, if possible, it should be discussed with the team, or if possible, maybe raise it with the team to see if there's a way around this, or to discuss how to avoid those pressures. And I acknowledge it is really difficult. It can be quite difficult to have that conversation. But it is, it can, there can be ways to work around it, but it is important to acknowledge that that can be a pressure. And if possible, there should be ways around trying to decrease that pressure, or at least acknowledging that it's a limitation. So support and collective care is part of that, trying to acknowledge that there can be challenges, and considering how to reduce any cumulative or vicarious impacts, including for the whole team. So not only the person with lived experience, but also people on the research team. And so it shouldn't all just be on the person with lived experience to engage in self-care. So sometimes it can be put on the person with lived experience to tell the research team their plan for engaging in self-care while being part of a research project. But rather than focusing on a plan of individualistic self-care plans, we should be aiming for a process of collective care and community care, where the whole team thinks about how we can support each other while engaging in research on something like suicide, or something, another research project that could be quite difficult. and considering how there are cumulative impacts or vicarious impacts on the research. So it doesn't just rest on someone to take care of themselves. It should be, you know, thinking about how we can all take care of each other and look out for each other, engaging in the project, and thinking of that in at a strength-based way rather than a lens of impairment or, you know, just resting on one person. So credit for work is really important, and it's important to acknowledge how that can be quite difficult. And there's a history of difficulty for that in lived experience work. People's lived experience often don't receive the credit that they deserve. And that includes, credit includes not only payment, but also co-authorship or acknowledgement. And having those discussions early can be really, really go a long way for reducing tension or people feeling undervalued. So altruism can be quite easily exploited for people's lived experience because people have a long history, people with lived experience have a long history of being invalidated and unheard because of the history of marginalization. And a person can be so desperate to have a seat at the table that it can be recognized as, you know, they'll volunteer, or they just value the opportunity so much that, you know, it's okay if, you know, they aren't paid, or they're paid less, or, you know, we just thank them for their time. But it's unethical to exploit that power imbalance or exploit that people wanting to volunteer their time in this way. So there can be a lot of difficulties from universities or organizations with budgeting, but there needs to be open and clear discussions about this so that people with lived experience don't feel devalued, and that there isn't this perpetual cycle of people being experiencing inequities in this work. So delays in payment need to be discussed, such as delays in processing invoices, so that people feel like they understand what's going on and that there's transparency in the processes if there is going to be issues with payment, or if the person is going to be paid in gift vouchers. You know, discussions about alternatives such as using invoices, or, you know, if there's another opportunity for them to feel like they're valued and a valued member of the research team. Because if these issues aren't discussed properly, it can lead to discourse, a sense of power imbalance, and feeling exploited in the research team. So another common tension point is risk aversion and dignity of risk. It can be common, particularly in suicide research, for a research team, particularly if a research team hasn't engaged in lived experience engagement before, such as co-design, to feel quite risk averse to having someone's lived experience as part of the research, and just having that hesitancy and uncertainty about how are we going to feel like we're supporting someone's lived experience about engaging in this research. Are they going to be safe? Is there going to be too much risk? Are they going to feel that they're reactivated, memories are reactivated? Are they going to be re-traumatized engaging in this work? And it's important to have those discussions and to acknowledge that there should be dignity of risk in inviting someone into this work, and that it's, you know, and of ethical importance to have people most affected by this issue and who have lived experience to be involved in this work, and to acknowledge that someone can lean into their strengths to be involved in this work and to make the decisions for themselves. And if they feel that they are supported and that they feel like they are at a place that they can engage in this work, that they can. And then to set up contingency plans with them to say that if they do need to have a step back from the work, that they can, so that everyone, and not only the person with lived experience, but other people involved in the research, other members of the research team, can step back or step back in to the research, and that there are contingency plans set up so that people feel that they're able to do that, and that there isn't an issue. And that's part of being involved in this research work and doing it well, and having that community care and culture of collective care and community care rather than individualistic self-care kind of plan. So you know, being transparent and having strong communication is that people can say, you know, I need to take a step back, or I want to take a step forward and have higher involvement in the work, and I can do that well. Next slide, please. So my kind of main takeaways from this is that the work is not without its challenges. Some of those main challenges would be sort of logistical, procedural challenges, as well as cultural challenges involved in lived experience research engagement. So a lot of it is that there's still a lot of stigma and power issues involved in how people's lived experience are perceived, particularly when engaging in research. Issues regarding how people's lived experience are perceived with regards to strengths. So there's still like this issue of hesitancy, and how there is the issue of hesitancy about inviting people's lived experience in, and you know, issues around skills training around you know, people learning about co-design methods or co-creation methods. But largely, I find the work really rewarding, really meaningful. It's an opportunity to make change for ongoing improvement and growth. And I think the more we work towards co-creation, co-design, and lived experience engagement in research, a lot of these challenges, a lot of the logistical, procedural, cultural issues will begin to be dismantled. People will become more familiar with this work, more familiar with why we need to do this, why people with lived experience need to be involved in research, and why it's so valuable, and why it deepens our understanding of things like suicide, other experiences of mental health challenges, and why it is so rewarding overall, and it really contributes to greater understanding and benefits our communities. So I really, really value this work. I encourage other people to become involved, and I encourage researchers to learn more about these methods.
Thank you so much, Raziel, and we'll just pass on to Luke next to share a little bit about his life as a researcher in this space.
Thank you, Raziel. I wish I had viewed your presentation before I took my dive into the deep end. And thank you to Roses for having me here today. Thank you to everyone who's here in the crowd here today. My presentation essentially is going to tell the story about how I metaphorically dove into the deep end to start researching suicide, which then allowed me to listen, to learn from individuals who've lived and live an experience of suicide. And I'm honoured to share this story with you today. I don't have a lived experience of suicide. Obviously, this carries implications for someone who researches suicide. Most notably, I'm forever learning how to best work with and learn from others. And as an early career researcher who graduated from their PhD 2 days ago, I really only have a limited experience in this field. But that said, in this short space of time, I've really developed a passion for elevating lived experiences within research. And unlike many suicide researchers who do enter this field due to lived experience or other interests, such as being exposed to suicide, I just happened to luckily stumble upon my passion for research, and in particular suicide research. It was during my honours year for my psychology honours years, I was conducting a psychobiography on Hunter S. Thompson, looking at his death by suicide. Now, a psychobiography essentially aims to understand historically significant individuals using psychological theories and taking into account the individual's public works and or behaviours. Now, you may be aware of Hunter S. Thompson as the author of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It's a wonderful read. If you haven't read it before, I recommend you to read it. But enough about him. Halfway through my year, I was reading his works of literature and writing my thesis and reviewing and understanding theoretical models of suicide, when it kind of dawned on me and I came to realise that this is really fascinating stuff. I wondered whether perhaps I could help towards bridging the gap between theory and, for lack of a better term, reality and what's actually happening in individuals' lives, with the ultimate goal of why I started psychology, to help people and prevent and help save lives in the future. And as I mentioned, I don't have lived experience of suicide. So before I started researching, I actually had very limited understanding about suicidality. Perhaps this lack of understanding was in essence, and perhaps counterintuitive, really helpful for me in my foray into data collection for a qualitative study that looked at the movement from thinking about suicide to acting on suicidal thoughts. I acknowledge my lack of understanding, and I designed the study with the aim of trying to understand and learn as much as possible from those who had lived and survived suicide attempts. Now, when I started my first interview, I was understandably a little bit nervous. I didn't know what to say or what not to say. I didn't want to say the wrong thing. I didn't want to offend. I didn't want to infuriate. I really didn't want to harm anyone, believe it or not. And really, as I reflect on this, I was terrified going into my first interview. But the crux of what I wanted to achieve was I didn't want to curtail anyone's storytelling. So I asked individuals to tell me as much as they wanted about whatever they wanted without censoring themselves, which meant all I had to do was listen to stories. That was it. I just listened. I just sat, listened, and ultimately learned something. And it turned out that people really appreciated this approach of the researcher just listening to their stories, believe it or not. It was remarkable. During these storytelling sessions, participants asked if they could just keep talking. They'd been interrupted and stopped previously. Of course, I said, yes, please keep going. I just want to sit here and listen. And they did. And other times, participants would ask if they wanted me to listen to all the details, because previously they'd been told that particular parts of their story perhaps shouldn't be told. Again, I said, yes, please tell me, because it is these unheard and sometimes censored elements of stories that have the potential to help us understand more about the movement from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide. And as you may appreciate, the less that is censored and restricted within context such as this, the greater the storytelling, the greater the connection between individuals. In each of the 14 storytelling sessions, there was laughter, there was swearing, and this all had a positive impact on me. I felt so lucky to be able to listen to individuals talk about some of their darkest and most difficult parts of their life. It really gave me a new perspective on the strengths of suicide attempt survivors that I would not have otherwise understood. Risk. Raziel mentioned risk. I don't think you can do suicide research without mentioning risk. This word carries so much weight in suicide research. So by this term, I'd realised my new perspective and on the strength of suicide attempt survivors. And it really gave me the confidence to design another study that was considered extremely high risk. Essentially, I was asking individuals with lived experience of both suicidal ideation and suicide attempts to complete 4 short surveys every day for 14 days. That in itself could be considered risky. But what added to that risk, that the surveys contained an item that asked if the participant had access to lethal means at that point in time. So you can see it's starting to get even more risky. Now we'll add another layer of risk. Responses weren't monitored in real time. They were monitored twice daily. So if there was intent to, or there was actual harm reported, it could be hours before I could, at best, try contacting the individual. Now, with all this in mind, you're probably wondering, who would volunteer to participate in such a study? Well, it turned out that quite a lot of people wanted to participate. Despite some rumblings, despite many good lucks, there was an expectation that individuals with lived experience of suicidality would shy away from such a study. But it was quite the opposite. Now, my guess is that individuals appreciated being given the chance to participate without being told, no, this is too great a risk for you. And I have to take this opportunity to thank Roses in the Ocean for helping with their recruitment for the study. Roses listened to the research proposal, listened to everything involved with the study's protocol, and they agreed that we should provide people with the opportunity to participate rather than deeming it too great a risk. I mean, who are we to decide what is too risky for another adult? In my opinion, very difficult to do so. We have to respect people's agency. As researchers, we can lay our research cards on the table. We can emphasize that they can withdraw at any point in time, and we can answer any questions before participating. But at the end of the day, only one person can decide whether or not to participate, and that's not the researcher. And I must note that this is my understanding, it's my opinion, and it may not reflect the often paternalistic and risk-averse nature of universities and other ethics committees. Believe it or not, conducting research with or without lived experience is very similar to life. Expect the unexpected. Now, in the context of the study I just mentioned, we expected that people would report intent to or actual harm. And this was simply the nature of the study. This was high-risk research. But what was unexpected were the phone calls that I had when someone did report intent and or self-harm. So I set the scene. I log into the platform twice a day, morning and afternoon, and I see an individual has reported intent and or harm. So I pick up the phone, I call them, and there's two occasions that stand out that I really didn't expect. The first, an individual thanks me for participating in the study because they used to check in with themselves at the end of the day, and they concluded, without saying what they said, it was a terrible day. However, because of this study, they're checking in with themselves 4 times a day and realizing that they may have had terrible moments throughout their day. Overall, their days were better than they'd previously concluded. Wonderful. Did not expect that at all. Second, an individual that reports harm does not answer. So I leave a voicemail, I leave a message. A little bit expected. However, what was unexpected was a text message from the participant that requested that I don't call them, that I check in with them via text. I was like, wow, that's genius. Why didn't I think of that? Yes, of course. If you want me to check in via text message, then let's do it that way. That's much better for everyone. I was very thankful for that request because it then feeds into future research designs, which again brings me to my next slide. In the relatively short time I've been researching within the field, I've learned to give and to listen to what people want, as opposed to telling people how it's going to be. And one way I try my best to express gratitude is having people in research participate and work with on the terms and the freedom to change those terms as they participate. I feel honoured to be able to, privileged to be able to listen, to learn and work with people who have lived experience of suicide. In fact, I wish I had a greater vocabulary to express my gratitude in a more articulate manner. Unfortunately, I do not. So instead, I do my best to display my gratitude through opportunities such as this webinar. And as someone who has stepped into the world of lived experience, or in fact, dove straight into the deep end, I offer my time to anyone who wants support stepping into this world. Looking back, I would have included individual lived experience at the outset of my research career. This would have provided me with much more confidence than the nerves and the terror that I perhaps incorrectly took into my first interview. And I offer these takeaways in addition to that. The most effective way that I've learned about lives of suicide attempt survivors is through listening. So my advice to researchers who are conducting research or working with people with experience is to just listen. My second takeaway is that suicide attempt survivors are strong and powerful. They have stories to tell, and this translates into knowledge that cannot be sourced anywhere. Their stories and experiences and inputs are vital for understanding the phenomenon of suicide. And building on what Roseal said, my takeaway for individuals who've lived experience is that researchers are slowly coming around to becoming better at working with you. And I suggest that expectations are clarified as best as possible by all parties at the start to prevent potential problems as the research progresses. Thank you for listening to my story today. There's a couple of articles that I've listed there, which are the studies that I drew upon for this presentation. And there's my email address if you'd like to touch base. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Luke. We really appreciate that. And now, even though we don't have too much time left remaining, I'm just going to open it up for a quick panel discussion between Kylie, Roseal, and Luke before we move into the Q&A. Kylie, did you want to start?
I think we thought it might be good to spend some time talking about, when things go really well versus when things don't go so well. I think, is that right, Luke and Roseal? And yeah, I thought, obviously I don't have a presentation today, so I'm here just to answer questions, and I know we have a short time, but more than happy to answer any questions afterwards. But I guess when I came along here, I was thinking about kind of the institutional response and how universities are kind of managing this environment at the moment. And there's certainly more and more sort of understanding and expectations that we're working with people with lived experience. And some researchers are really on board and developing skills, but it's new for a lot of researchers. Some researchers are really very, very new or maybe haven't thought about it at all. And then we have ethics committees at universities that are approving this research and also have varied experience working with people with lived experience. So unfortunately, as Roseal and Luke, I think both described, that sometimes there's a lot of will there on the behalf of researchers, but sometimes the institutions are a bit slow, I suppose, to catch up. And there still can be, as Luke described, some sort of institutional barriers to people with lived experience, and some very, I think ethics committees are getting better at supporting the participation of people with lived experience, but there can be still those sort of paternalistic views, I suppose, around people's autonomy and power in terms of determining their own ways of contributing and whether contributing is safe for them. And so, yeah, I think that's some really important points that Roseal and Luke both raised about how researchers really need to do that advocacy work to remove some of those barriers to participation. But yeah, certainly there is a range of experiences and responses that people with lived experience might experience in those environments. Roseal, Luke?
Yeah, I will give an example, I think, of a research project I'm on currently where I think it's being done really well. And that is, we're currently developing a measure for screening suicidality and self-harm in children. So there's no measure currently in existence for screening suicidality and self-harm in children aged 12 and younger. So it's a very exciting project because it's very needed to have a measure, a self-report measure for children of this age. And it's very important to us that we're developing this measure that has close involvement for people with lived experience like myself who were suicidal at that young age. And it also has carers involved as well, and members of the research team are very passionate about this. You know, there are people like myself who have a history of research as well, so are research trained, and some people who don't have research background. So it's been a wonderful project, and I think what has been great about it is that all the meetings, I think, were really honoring people's strengths, and also really opened up with, you know, what people wanted to bring about designing the questions, to, you know, what was your experiences of suicidality at those young ages, what was really important that you think people needed to know, you know, taking people back into experiences also was like, how do you think it would be safe to open these discussions to children? We discussed really early about you know, people's developmental understanding of death, dying, and suicidality at, you know, young ages. So it's also really important to consider, you know, cultural understandings of suicidality, you know, developmental ages. So we were really, really, you know, diving into that stuff in this research. And I think it was really important how we approached that. And how we approached all of the things that people were bringing to the table, including, you know, carers' understandings of things. And I think also a way of approaching this research project that I think was really important was at the outset, we discussed our ways of working and how it would feel safe to be working through this project together, how we would know that we were, and, you know, we were evaluating that every meeting. Were we reaching those values? Were we feeling like it was safe and comfortable for everyone? Did everyone want to contribute in the meeting? Did we want to do, you know, emails? Did we want to send things through together? So there was ways that people could contribute that weren't necessarily just in meetings, but, you know, lots of different ways. If you wanted to, you know, make a recording and send that through of, you know, thoughts at different stages, things like that. So I think it can be really important to decide how you'll work together and ways you'll navigate that in a research project. So that's a reflection, I think, of a way that has felt really, really comfortable and really safe and really good that I've experienced recently. And I think it's been a really valuable project.
Thanks so much for that, Rosiel. And I'm mindful that we do have a few minutes left for questions. This has been such an insightful webinar, and thank you to all three of you for providing your insights. And we'll you know, Julia and I will share our reflections towards the end of the session. Just to remind everybody who has joined us today, I know that there are some questions in the Q&A. If we don't get to everybody's questions today, we will of course reach out to our researchers and ask them these questions offline so that we can come back to you. So please rest assured, if we don't answer your questions today, we will certainly answer them in the coming days. The first question I have is for Luke. And from an ethics point of view, what support was offered to the lived experience participants to be involved in the research that you undertook?
Good question. Thank you. Before participating, we had the Roses in the Ocean readiness for research document, which helped prepare anyone that may have been concerned about their participation. During interviews, or as I like to call them, storytelling sessions, there was really relied on me to read social cues and to ask people, are you happy to continue talking about this, and to effectively check in with them as they were telling the story. If you want to grab a glass and water, you know, I'm happy to take 5 and come back if you would like. And then after the interviews, I would debrief within, I think we said within 72 hours, but typically it was within 2 days. For the other study, the ecological momentary assessment study, we had Lifeline's number at the end of every survey. So there was a total of 56 surveys per person or potential. So we had that at the end. And there wasn't a follow-up phone call after participation. There was a follow-up email to thank them and remind them of the participant information sheet and the details. And that was really what we could offer.
Thank you, Luke. And this one is to Rosiel. When you're talking about the research project that you're working on at the moment, what age range was this research?
So this measure that we're currently developing is for ages 6 to 12. And the research team, we have a variety of ages, but we will be involving, once the measure is finished being developed, we will be trialing it with people, children in that age range, with support of carers, and then with clinicians as well. We'll be trialing that measure.
Thanks, Rosiel. I guess this one's to both. Luke, we'll go to you first, and to Rosiel and Kylie. Do you record your interviews, and how do you obtain informed consent around this, including withdrawing consent?
Yes, thank you. When I did my interviews, it was 2021 or 2020, I can't remember. But anyway, we were all locked in our homes. So interviews were via Zoom, and they were recorded, and consent was via a consent form, but also check in with participants or with individuals before they would like to participate, and withdrawing consent if you recorded your interview and you wanted to take that data back to yourself, then you were more than welcome to do that up until, I believe, and I'd have to double check whether it had been published or whether data analysis had started. I can't recall correctly. So there was one point in time, I can't remember if that was when data analysis began or whether before the article was accepted for publication.
Thanks, Luke. And yourself, Kylie?
Yeah, similarly, I suppose that we get consent beforehand to record, and I always give people the option of not having it recorded. I guess recorded is for our purpose so that we can have, not relying on our memory. But I have occasionally had people who've said, I'd rather it wasn't recorded. And so then we take notes. And then at the end of the interview, and we do a lot of interviews these days via Zoom still, because it seems to have become what people are used to, or by phone. And then at the end of the interview, we would always say, are you happy with what you've said? Now that you've heard all the questions, are you still happy to participate? Is there anything you wish you hadn't said? And we always give people the opportunity to contact us afterwards if, afterwards they change their mind, or some people like to have a look at the transcript and review that. And sometimes people will black things out afterwards and say, I'd rather you didn't include that. So we try to give people as much autonomy as possible around that. But then, as Luke said, it does reach a point where, it's a bit hard because we de-identify all of our participants too. And so that means at some point you kind of do get put into the mix, I suppose, and it becomes impossible to remove you after you get to a certain point. But we try to make sure that people have that autonomy kind of right up until that point, I suppose, so that they can make those decisions around that. And even if researchers don't do that, that's always a participant's right, and so people can always reach out to researchers, and they should be explaining that in the information that you get beforehand around when you have that choice and when that choice is no longer possible.
Thank you, Kylie. And we'll come to you, Rosiel, for that question as well.
Yeah, there's some different ways of doing this. Also, I've been involved in studies that are, quantitative and qualitative. So, there can be different ways of letting people withdraw their consent at different levels when it's qualitative and quantitative, right up until data analysis started, or even after data analysis has started. depending on on how they've been de-identified, whether it's done with a code or whether it's done with a code name. And sometimes when giving people autonomy about how they're de-identified, if you're using a code name, sometimes people like to choose their code name. And sometimes you can give people an option to do that. And that can, make people feel comfortable if they, want to choose a code name so they feel like, they're anonymized, but they have a sense of ownership about their own story. And I think that can be quite a nice way to have people having a sense of it's their story, but they still, get a sense of choosing how they're sharing it and how their story is portrayed, because it's the name they've chosen in the research. If it's qualitative data, if it's just a code, sometimes you can withdraw people's data even once it's been pulled together, if it's a code. So there are different ways of doing that, and that is often in the information sheet, and that should all have been done in ethics. But yeah, I've been part of different projects where their data can still be withdrawn even after its analysis has started.
Thank you, Rosiel. Well, I can't believe, but we have 1 minute left of this webinar, and there have been so many valuable and essential insights for research and suicide prevention shared today. I think that there's lots of takeaways from this, and you can just tell by the comments in the chat how valuable people found this session. And of course, we will be answering all of the questions that we haven't answered today. But if people have questions offline, then of course we'll answer those as well. Just a few points on reflection, how much lived experience and lived experience in research deepens our understanding of suicide, how lived experience is vital for new knowledge, and the need for transparency. Yes, there's risk, but we have to weigh that up versus agency. We've heard autonomy and agency and self-efficacy and deep listening heard, right from the beginning of this webinar today. And so I would like to thank the researchers who have joined us today for sharing their knowledge and their insights. And I know that, as you said, Luke, if you had heard Rosiel's, insights before you'd even started your research, you would have found that really valuable. And I will finish by saying that quoting Luke, the more we hear what we have not heard, the greater our research findings can be. And I think that, that's something that all three of you kind of spoke about during this webinar today. So I thank you all. Julia, if you'd like to just wrap up and talk about the poll.
Thank you. So everyone, as you leave today's webinar, please know that a quick poll will come up on your screens just to assist us in ensuring that we're always delivering the sort of content that you're looking for as members of our collective. We will also be having our community mentoring session coming up for Tuesday, the 27th of August, as well as our next speakers mentoring session, which will be very timely in the lead up for World Suicide Prevention Day and is going to be held on Wednesday, the 4th of September. And our final webinar under the Learning Development series will be held on Thursday, the 5th of September, and we'll be focusing on workforce evolution. So we hope to see you all there for our last one of the series for this year. And thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.